David, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, y'all. David Zendzian. I am a field CISO for Pivotal. What that means is I help customers understand security and compliance needs and how they can solve their needs with the Pivotal platforms in their environments. Hopefully you're here to listen to us talk about auditing. I actually came from an auditing background. I was a PCI Q, actually before that I was a PCI PA QDSP or whatever it was called before PCI. And then I was a QSA for about 8 years. I've been a pen tester, I've been a code reviewer, been CISO at a bank. Basically been in security for over 30 years. I love this stuff. I could literally talk for days. We've been actually prompted by a few folks we should just do a filibuster. We're calling this day 3, so we're going to talk from today until tomorrow, so y'all are going to stay here.
We can do it too.
And Steve?
So like David, same role, so field CISO. We kind of, he's based in the east coast of the US, I'm on the west, and so we kind of divide the world up that way. We have our triad counterpart, Jerome, here from Asia Pacific. And we spend our days talking to customers, right? We've both been CISOs, we've been security directors, we've been in security engineering, right? So we have felt the pain of owning security programs and audit programs for customers. And so our job really is to, A, kind of help have those conversations around, well, what does this mean in a pivotal world or in a cloud native world? What does it mean? That's what happens when you go on battery, right? Your laptop dies. What does it mean when you have to meet with the auditors on a cloud native platform? And then, how do you roll that and integrate it with your overall security program, right? And that's kind of, and so we spend our days with those conversations. It's kind of a, how do you do this? How can I integrate it? And then we take a lot of feedback from customers and help funnel that in with our R&D organization, right? So a lot of the pivotal field folks bring suggestions and requirements and requests from customers back into our software development teams. We help kind of funnel and focus some of the security aspects of that, right? Because we've kind of felt we felt some of those pains. We're going to give a little of a caveat to this talk today, right? So we've been working on this. This is basically a one-day workshop compressed into a 1-hour teaser, okay? Because covering the topic of how do you really do a full-blown audit, a compliance-related audit across the Pivotal platform, it's a lot. There's a lot there. We've used the PCI requirements as the frame for this conversation, but most of what we talk about here would apply in, whether you have an 853 requirement, FedRAMP, high trust, you pick it, the same kinds of concepts would apply. So we've designed this to hopefully get all the way to the end. We're crossing our fingers because we cut a lot of stuff out. But you've got our email addresses here. If you're a slide picture taker, right, take a picture of that slide because you can reach out to us after this and you can say, hey, I'd like the full slide deck. We can send that to you.
I will say though that the slide deck will probably be coming out with.
It will be. So I've confirmed you will get access to all the slides via SlideShare, but they said that could take a couple weeks. So there may be a couple week lag in between today and when these slides get published. If you have a burning need, you can email us, we can get you that. But more importantly, we can actually work with you and your account teams to actually schedule that full day conversation, right? With you, with your security teams, with your platform teams. This is what we live to do, is coming there. So,
and it doesn't have to be on auditing. If you have security issues you're trying to work through, if you're trying to figure out where the roadmap is going, what's happening, reach out to your account team. We will be there to help you. Between the three of us, we've got the whole world covered, and just about every customer is our purview.
If there's any Hawaii customers in here, ask for me by name. Okay. Right. This is our safe harbor statement. So we expect you to all have all these words memorized here. Okay. Point of this is we actually do talk about a couple of forward, talk about some forward-leaning statements for Pivotal, some product direction, maybe some product roadmap items. Basically, all this says is, look, that is not. If it's not in today's release, there's no guarantees, right? So don't bet your business on it. Don't make business decisions on something we say that might or might not happen. Fair?
That seems good to me.
All right, let's go backwards. This is our agenda. Like I said, we architected this around. So these are, if you're not familiar with them, these are the PCI DSS famous 12, Fab 12. What do you call it? The 12 rules in PCI DSS.
Except we cut 2 of them out.
You'll notice there's 2 missing, if you can count, right? There's 2 rules missing. And so we actually kind of mentioned that later. Rule 12 is not here. And Rule 9 is not here.
I will say, I am working with a couple customers. The whole idea of shifting left and doing cloud native security and what does it look like generally means that your policies are written 20 years ago or 30 years ago, or if you're government 50 years ago, probably need to be updated. And we're willing to have those conversations and help you understand what really is different, how does it change, how do we actually look at the way of doing things, but that's not for today.
So as we said, as we go along, we're going to go at a pretty quick clip here. You're going to see a lot of slides that are not the normal pivotal slides, because there's a lot of slides with a lot of words. There's a lot of code. There's some command examples and other things in here. We don't expect you to memorize all those things from these slides, right? You can get the slide deck later, or we can send you these things later. But there is a lot of information on these slides.
But I would recommend, if you really are interested in this sort of thing, you're going to go through audits, you want to get your security teams educated, you want to really plan for what's happening, or better yet, you're working with auditors, you want to make sure they're educated on how to properly audit the environment. What we cover here is only about 10 to 15% of what the real deck is. So you can take pictures if you're tweeting. We love it. I'm DM006. You can include me on that one. But no, realistically, this is a great starting point. We just want to start the conversation. And it looks like we actually have a standing room only in here. So y'all really love audits.
Everybody loves audits. And so then with every good audit, notice this is rule 0. Rule 0 is preparing for the audit, right? How do you scope the environment? How do you get ready ahead of time? How do you build things out so they're easier to audit, right? And so, David, I'm going to talk about some of these items. I can start with these because these are some of my favorite ones. MFA, jump host, PAM, privileged access management. Before coming to Pivotal, I was a CISO for an identity company. So identity, access management, those kinds of things are near and dear to my heart. And so one of the key things that starts all of this is, look, if you're going to have a platform like Pivotal in your environment, you're going to audit it, you have got to demonstrate how you're controlling administrative access, not just from a compliance perspective, but just from a plain out security perspective, right? Privileged access management, how you control privileged access, how you monitor privileged access is core to any security program today. And so you need to think about that in the Pivotal environment, right? How are you going to provide a jump host? How are you going to control access to that jump host? How are you going to provide multi-factor authentication for that jump host? And how are you going to record the activities of the administrators, right? The platform administrators. Because at the end of the day, that's part of monitoring for malicious activity. Because if you know anything about the bad guys today, right? The bad guys are going to be using the accounts of your people, right? They're going to have different accounts. They're going to take over accounts in your environment, and they're going to do things they shouldn't, right? So,
which goes to the bottom here. Yep. Don't manually add users, don't share accounts. Let alone in PCI. PCI says you don't share accounts. So when you're having auditors come in, you got to, I think the Pivotal model is great. Pairing is a great model for looking at auditing. It's a great way of looking at how do you actually have your administrators, your operators, people who have access, your developers, access in the environment and provide the evidence necessary to pass an audit and document it. So keep that in mind. You don't just go and create a bunch of accounts and give it to the auditor and say, hey, just go log in and look at it. You're not going to get the answers you want. It's going to cause more problems than you really want to get into. And then how do you get rid of them? How does it move forward? So,
yeah, this is that conversation Dave was talking about, right? There's a couple of ways of approaching audit. One of them is, hey, give your auditor a read-only account and say, have at. It's probably not going to be successful in a Pivotal environment, and the reason is they don't know what they're looking at, right? Most of your auditors will not have seen a Pivotal environment unless they've been working with you a long time and you've trained them, right? So you're going to have to work alongside of them at least the first few times they audit this platform to get them to really understand it. We gave you some commands here. This is, instead of giving your auditor direct access themselves, you can either walk them through the UI or you can pull out manifests, right? So there's some commands here for pulling out the manifests, and then you can walk them through those configuration items, right? But the bottom line is unless your auditor is really good, you're not going to give them this access.
And at the same time, also some of those manifests and the details. Keep in mind, Steve and I are here to help you help them. So as you're going through these processes, definitely feel free to reach out to your account teams, loop us in. We can help explain to the auditors, help you explain how you're going to explain things to them, because the way they look at things is not the same way an operator looks at things. So you want to make sure that you're looking at it from the point of view they're looking at. So scope? In scope, scope. This is a huge one, and I've seen many environments. People try extremely hard to say, oh, this is our PCI environment, so we can make it easier over here. Just personally, as someone who was an auditor, I would just beyond Pivotal, I just want to say this because my one little things I rant about all the time. Don't have double standards. It's hard to have, we're going to have one policy here, and one policy here. It really should be applied across the way you do it, business as a whole. But when it comes to in scope, though, this is really important. You have to understand the way the platforms work, the way you scope things. And we'll get into it in a second here. There's some caveats to the way the platform's put together. That even just using isolation segments doesn't necessarily mean you're separating the scope of different environments. So we'll get to that in a few minutes, though. Yep.
And then cloud native policies and procedures, right? You'll find that in many organizations, right, your policies and procedures were not written to be friendly to cloud native, right? For example, you may have a policy that says you have to run antivirus on all systems, right? Well, if you're running ephemeral, immutable systems and you're measuring those in different ways, those policies probably need to be updated. Now, PCI is going to require you have AV no matter what. But I use that as an example. When you're moving to cloud-native platforms and you're doing things like ephemeral servers, you're doing things like repaving, you need to stop thinking about, that's another one, like patching and measuring patch velocity. If you're in a cloud-native environment and you're repaving weekly and you're applying the latest updates every week, there's no such thing as patch velocity anymore, right? And so your policies really need to be updated to reflect those kinds of concepts.
And I'll throw out my favorite one, wildcard. Who here has dealt with the issue of
Wildcard
policies and
certs.
wildcards?
Yeah, wildcard certs.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. It is what it is. So we just got to figure out how to help the business move forward and look at that.
So this is what David was talking about with the scoping.
So isolation segments. Who here uses isolation segments to actually segment? Okay, do you have regular workloads in your regular pass network still? Okay, well, if you look at this, your pass network, you have Diego Brains, and you also have your regular, other pass jobs. So if you're looking at in scope, the actual control plane, the actual parts that control the Cloud Foundry environment, they're going to be in scope because the control mechanisms, the hypervisors, all the IS, all those are in scope because they control the environment. If a hacker takes control of the cloud controller, they can do whatever they want to your environment. So the auditors are going to want to look at that. So if you've actually built things out where you're like, oh, I've got a PCI segment, I've got my regular segment, I'm putting everything else in there, well, the top network's in scope, which means all those workloads in your past network are in scope because they're in the same network. Mm-hmm. I don't know if people realize that. I can see a couple people going, really serious looks going on from folks right now. Yeah. That's one of those conversations. So I've seen a lot of companies look at, they have a complete separate foundation for PCI, or they have an isolation segment for each business unit, and they don't run anything in the past network. Right. So
some of the other unique challenges, of course, in auditing a pivotal platform is we talk a lot about some of the things that are automated, like we talk a lot about stem cells as an example. Well, stem cells are used by Bosch to create Bosch deployed VMs. We talk about adding in security controls like ClamAV or FIM, file integrity monitoring, as Bosch add-ons, right, that get deployed to what? Every Bosch deployed VM. What is not a Bosch deployed VM in Pivotal? The Opsman VM and the Bosch Director VM. So don't forget about those. When you're thinking about your audit and you're thinking about scoping your audit, think about those VMs and how you're going to talk about those with your auditors. Because if your auditor's savvy enough, they're going to figure out that those other controls don't cover those two VMs. And so you've got to have some account for that in your environment. The other thing is that because of the on-boot requirements for Opsman as a specific machine, right, the way you update it, the frequency of updates that we release, all of those things are a little different for that particular VM, right, because the update cycle and everything else. So again, you have to think about how you account for that in your policies, in your procedures, so that there's not a disconnect there between policies and procedures and what your auditor is looking for.
And this last one here is kind of a PCI specific, but it ties to any department anywhere. Everyone can ask you, where's your diagram?
Where's your diagram?
So how do you diagram Cloud Foundry? So there's a great reference architecture. You can easily start with that, but they're always going to ask, well, how many servers do we have? Where are things at? There are mechanisms we can get into. You can dump configs and tie things together, but there really is no easy mechanism to do this diagram. So again, it's probably going to be a policy change. It's going to be a way of how do we look at a platform environment to draw and define diagrams in that. You might have inventory requirements. It's actually, I was talking to a customer this last week. How do we actually maintain an inventory of our systems in the environment? Well, one, do you need to? But two, how do you actually look at that as a business? And it's not as simple as it seems because the traditional tools aren't built to work with those environments. So we're going to keep going.
As we said, this is a day-long conversation we've cut down. So we can talk about any one of these 12 rules for like hours. So. Rule 1, segmentation, secure architecture starts with IS segmentation, right? This is important. Again, it goes back to that scoping conversation, but you want to have your compliant environment cleanly segregated from the rest of your environment at the network level, right? And that means firewalls, that means isolation, because if you don't fully segment, you don't properly segment that compliance environment from the rest, now everything's in scope. Now, if everything in your environment's in scope for your audit, great. You don't have to worry about this as much. But most organizations, they have a compliant environment and then like a corporate environment and maybe some other things. So you've got to make sure this segmentation at the IaaS. And when we say IaaS, that could be vSphere, right, on-premise. That could be a public cloud provider. It could be colo. It's like whatever you're using for infrastructure, right?
And don't forget egress. As an auditor in the past, there's many environments I've been into. You have great ingress firewall protections, but nothing on the outbound. And the thing about in the Pivotal platform is there are great tools for egress protections. Who here has actually updated your ASGs?
Few, good.
No, that's great.
That's good.
Great.
Who's heard about dynamic egress? Yeah, all right. Who's looking forward to it? Yes.
Me,
Yeah.
I am.
Egress down to the app level, we love it. Dynamic, yeah. So, but egress is a big thing, especially for like PCI and other compliance frameworks. And then, of course, isolation segments are the internal, right? So we talk about IaaS segmentation to segment your Pivotal platform from the rest of your network. ISO segments for segmenting workloads on platform.
Just keep going.
Keep going, right? Everybody, yeah.
I'm trying to stop myself from talking.
Yeah. We could talk about all these slides for minutes, but David mentioned some of those requirements early on. Understand how ISO segments work. Understand the different choices for the Go router in and out of the segment. If you're in, you have to put multiple copies, perhaps multiple isolation segments in. So this is an architecture thing that you really kind of need to understand.
And let's not forget the idea, though, that just because you have a certain architecture now, it is not that difficult to change your architecture. And this is a difficult thing for people to understand who have not gotten used to the platforms. It is just a defined manifest. You can easily redefine and say, we can create an isolation segment and then take our pipeline and push to the new environment. It's not the end of the world to say, hey, we're going to re-architect our environment. And, in the old world, you have to go and spin up new servers, build firewall rules, reconfigure things. Nowadays, if you have to re-segment things, just create the new one and point your pipeline toward it. So now we're going to get into some of the details here. Actually, some dynamic egress, some ASGs. What are we looking at? How do they look? One of the things to keep in mind is dynamic egress and ASGs are tied together. So dynamic egress is still beta. You're going to find out that the default ASG rule of allow all means if you're using just dynamic egress and haven't removed that allow all, your dynamic egress is still allow all. So
Yeah.
it's not, again, it's still beta. It's not in documentation on that piece yet, but it is one of those interesting things to look at. And I wanted to go on a little bit more on the issue, but also talking to you about the actual container-to-container networking. I assume a couple of folks here are using this, and I don't know if you realize, but you can actually span into isolation segments with container-to-container.
Yeah. Container-to-container networking does not honor isolation segment boundaries because it is an overlay network. It's not affected by isolation segments. So if you're in a compliance environment where you have mixed workloads on the same foundation, you have to be really careful with container-to-container networking and make sure you're not bridging across that isolation segment boundary. So here's some auditing tips, right? So we did do, so another thing to throw out here, these first couple of sections, so R1, R2, R3, we're going through some pretty detailed auditing, like you'll see a lot of BOSH and OM and CF commands in these slides to give you a feel for the level of depth, right, that you have to get to when you start having this auditing conversation about how to audit the platform. Later in the deck, we stop providing so many of those examples because we're going to run out of time. That's what happens. And again, so we keep toe stomping this, right? But we're just trying to give you a quick teaser here for a depth of information that we can get to in like a fuller conversation with you on this. So we're trying to get, for those customers where it makes sense, like one-day workshops on this stuff set up so we can really help you get through this. But at the IaaS level, you've got to audit all these things, right? How are the security groups set up? How are the firewalls set up? What's the router configuration and ACLs? You should have ways to do that, right?
And before we finish that one thing, hopefully all of your IaaS stuff is all terraformed and you've got predefined configurations. They're in some source code safe somewhere.
I see people laughing.
well,
ideally, someday. Yeah.
This is a path and a pattern that makes it easier to audit. So if you don't have that, there are traditional mechanisms for auditing ASGs or security groups and all the things within the IaaS. But if you do have the templates, it's so much easier to show consistency. You can say, how is it enforced? Because one of the questions the auditors are going to ask is, how do you enforce these rules? How do you keep someone from going in there and changing a rule? Well, if you've got a Terraform script that your automation pipelines are constantly pushing back out again, it doesn't matter if someone changes something. Hopefully you still log and you capture they did that so you can go actually deal with that happening. But if you're going based on terraforming, you can actually force the configuration to be what your defined approved configuration is. It's a great control, and hopefully if you don't have it, we can talk to the right people and help your teams build that out there. So how do we audit this?
Yeah.
This is where I actually started having fun. People look at me and go, why is this fun? Because honestly, I love knowing how things work. It's one of those things that drives me. Some of these configs you want to point out, you can walk your auditor through the actual ops man. You can go through the actual web interface and show configs. All of these options, when you get that manifest config, you can still audit those. Mm-hmm. There's actually a customer I'm working with right now. They're taking the manifest and we've highlighted, actually I didn't, the PA did because they're awesome. Highlighted all those configuration options throughout the entire manifest config, And they're actually building a system right now to monitor that manifest. They're going to, on a regular daily basis, export the manifest, map it back to this configuration monitoring, and build a daily compliance monitoring program on the entire foundation configuration. Yep. So there's things you can do to automate this and make this better. Again, we didn't show that in this right now. This is just the start of this, but there's a lot more we can get into. But then you start getting into the actual command line options that actually, how do you actually do isolation segments? How do you look at the spaces in the orgs? And you know, the details around actually dumping the information to show the auditor how this is. Because part of the audit is going to say, show me this. They want to document it. They want to actually show evidence of it. So they might want screen captures. They might want dumps. So this is the beginning of, you'll start seeing the isolation segment configuration details.
Yeah, and so for those who may or may not be using ISO segments, right, isolation segments can actually be assigned, multiple orgs and spaces can be assigned into segments. So it's a many-to-one option. And so when you're auditing them, right, you'll have to audit, you have to use the CF command line to show what ISO segments you have, but then you're also going to have to list out the orgs and spaces that are assigned to them if you want to demonstrate to your auditor what's in those spaces. There's usually going to be multiple ones, so you'll have to repeat this process. That middle bullet's pretty important, right? So what we tell you in our documentation and in our best practices is if you're using isolation segments, you should also use your IaaS firewall rules to enforce that isolation of those segments, right? So part of showing this is demonstrating what isolation segments you have, but also show the corresponding IaaS firewall rules that go with it. That way your auditor can understand there's multiple checkpoints on that, right? And we got some doc references in here where we talk about that. So as you follow up on this later, you can pull those pieces in.
And container, I mean, this is one, again, we didn't show a humongous detail. The output from this, you can show the options and details around it. So when you're dumping this information,
this is the output.
Yeah. Well, these are the columns. We didn't show the examples of it. Right. But to get into details around this, though, you still have to know what's allowed. You know, this is just going to show you the configuration. Your auditor definitely has no idea. So you're still going to have to know from the segments that are defined which ones are supposed to talk to each other, which ones are supposed to be in the areas. So, and this is kind of the pre-audit side, that, you know, prepping for the audit, making sure that you have knowledge of what's supposed to be there for your organization. Yeah,
and this is mostly, again, in the case where you've got a foundation that has compliant workloads in the same foundation as non-compliant workloads, right? Because once your whole foundation, let's say you have the entire foundation is in scope for your PCI DSS audit, the C2C rules don't necessarily matter, right? Because every application in the whole platform is in scope, and so you may not necessarily need to go through this piece.
Unless, of course, you are concerned what can talk to each other.
Yeah, well, that's a security problem. So I'm trying to focus on the compliance need versus the security need, right? So on the security side, you always care what's talking to each other, right? Mm-hmm. And then this is where we talked about this already, but this is where, again, we're caveating that if you're using container-to-container ISO segments, it can bridge that, so you have to be careful with that piece.
So ASGs and egress, these are always fun. So there are different ways of looking at this. You can actually, we talked about a little bit of the dynamic egress at first. Being beta, it is curl commands in the CF command line, so hopefully you're comfortable with that. Actually, I see Parth, you're pretty comfortable with that. So. Not that you've ever run these commands before. But you know, auditing security groups, non-monitoring ASGs, first, make sure you're using them. It is a pivotal recommended practice, even though when you install the foundation, you basically put a big yes in the answer saying, we acknowledge we're going to come back and look at this. Typically, during a typical rapid engagement, a dojo, wherever you want to look at it, the focus is on getting it to production, getting out the door. It generally it's supposed to be an after the fact. You as a business need to look at your applications and understand what they connect to and what ASGs need to have. And many application developers really don't understand, what do our applications need to function? How are they, what are these ASGs supposed to be? And it's really difficult to see that go to the next step. So I would ask you to go back and look at your foundations and see, do you even have egress segmentation put in place? And if you don't, it's not the easiest thing, but it is a recommended option, and you need to really look at it and say, is this something we can do for the platform? It is a great control. Tied together with making sure you have MTLS down to the application. So there's a lot of good controls in the platform if you actually leverage them. And actually looking at this, the next one actually goes into our actual ASG rules. And this is one of those ones also, you can list them, but you have to have knowledge of what you're supposed to have for this. So your auditor's going to look at these rules and they're going to be like, okay, every single line they're going to get in these rules, you say, well, this is talking to this or this is talking to this. What are those? Because now whatever is allowed egress to, in PCI, in scope is defined as those systems that store, process, or transmit cardholder data, or that are connected to them. An egress rule that says I'm allowed to you means I'm connected to you. So anything that's defined in ASG or dynamic egress is a connected system and is in scope for the audit. And this is just a sample. And again, we have a really good detail, so we want to get in this part here. But I want to point out here, you want to make sure you don't see that bottom one.
That's the default allow rule, in case you don't recognize it. That's the default allow rule that comes built into the platform. Well, it's actually slightly different now, but that used to be what it was. And you definitely don't want to see that rule bound.
So if you see this in there, take a step back and examine your application.
If you're in a compliant environment, right? And the other, even in a non-compliant environment, right? One would argue that if you're managing an environment security-wise, you should be controlling access, egress. Now, I just recently talked to a retail customer I'm working with, and they're managing egress at the external edge, right? So their Pivotal platform is surrounded by a network segment. All egress traffic has to flow basically through a big F5 on the edge of their system, and they want to control egress there. That's fine, right? That's perfectly acceptable. Makes this piece a little easier. Yeah. But you have to make those conscious decisions, right? You have to design it that way, write it in your policies, and then be able to show your auditor, hey, this is where we're doing egress, right?
And one of the difficult things with either of the dynamic egress or ASGs is they are IP based. So another customer I've worked with actually has outbound proxies in their entire corporate environment. Not everybody has that. A lot of financial institutions do. So I would also recommend if you either with or without this, examine, does this really solve your needs? If you have anything that's DNS based in your environment, if you're talking to a third-party service that's DNS based, you really might want to examine proxies as a way of controlling that outbound too. But have something that controls it, especially if your application is publicly accessible. The platform itself, no matter what controls you have, the application is what's going to be hacked. So as soon as somebody gets into the environment, without any rules around it, they have access to everything around it as well.
So now we're into Rule 2. We made it through Rule 0 and Rule 1. That's good. We're up to Rule 2. We're cooking.
So we have this conversation a lot. Everyone asks, how do we know that we actually have hardened systems, default configurations, out of the box, secure by default? It's a very common conversation we have. There's some great documentation. Doesn't mean we can't build on it, but there's some excellent documentation around this process. And actually the details around the stem cell hardening. And there's a lot of things that happen within Pivotal to release a stem cell just to get it to you in your pipelines that has a lot of hardening and monitoring and control segments in there. And again, we'll talk about those on site. It's just too hard to talk about all right now. But these parts are really what's key to making this work. And we have a couple folks here who are part of the process to actually do some CIS mapping. So CIS is a standard that's used by a lot of auditors because it's international, it's an accepted standard. And they use it to actually make sure that what you're doing is based upon industry standard hardening techniques. So Pivotal is, I don't want to say if it's there yet, but it's really close to having our CIS benchmark published and available, which is great because I'm actually in talks with folks like Qualys and Tenable and other companies who are actually ready to actively engage and incorporate the Pivotal CIS benchmark into their scanning tools. This will allow you to use your existing tools, or we have our compliance scanner within Pivotal that can be used to monitor and look at these sort of standards.
Two things to caveat for me on this slide. The bottom one's important, right? This section actually talks about vendor default passwords, right? When you're talking about PCI DSS, it's good to point out that there is no such thing. When you do a Pivotal platform install, right, it's customizing all internal passwords are customized to that installation. You set a couple of key ones as part of that deployment. Like, there's no such thing as a Scott Tiger. Who knows Scott Tiger? Come on, raise your hand. All right, there's some old folks out there. There's no Scott Tiger in the Pivotal platform. So that's actually where this rule came from, I think. And the other thing on here to note, build packs, right? Build packs are, of course, an inherent piece of the Pivotal application service or the PaaS platform. When you move into PKS or the Kubernetes world, right, build packs are an interesting piece of that picture. If you're starting to do or looking at running compliant workloads or workloads that require compliance audits on PKS or on Kubernetes, you're going to have to solve for this problem, right? And the Pivotal build service and the other things coming with it, the cloud native build packs, those are going to be important to this conversation in the compliance side, because you're going to have to demonstrate how in your Kubernetes environment, the operating system and the runtime environments are properly configured and against what standard they're configured, right? So that's something to recognize as we move into the Kubernetes world.
And let's also point out the fact that if you are using your build packs and have applications out there, just repaving your platform does not make sure your applications are on the latest build pack.
Hey, that's my line.
I stole it from you.
Restaging applications, and then we'll talk about that when we go through the auditing here. So auditing, right, this is again about auditing these things. So you've got to audit the fact, so it's great that Pivotal gives you these stem cells, and it's great that Pivotal gives you these build packs. If you never apply them to your platform, what are you auditing, right? So that's really what we're talking about here. So the top line, running the compliance scanner. How many people are familiar with the Pivotal Compliance Scanner? Yep, great. We love that tool. A lot of feedback. So if you are using it or if you've tried it, give us some feedback. We actually like to help. The product team really enjoys feedback on this. They're continually trying to update it. But it's a great way to demonstrate what benchmarks your VMs at any given time, what the VMs are compliant with. It is not a vulnerability scanner, right? It's a configuration compliance scanner, not vulnerability scanner. So I always like to point that out.
It is worth mentioning, though, if you have internal controls you like to monitor for, you can extend it.
Yep.
And the R&D team who runs the compliance scanner would love to work with you to help you extend your own internal corporate requirements into the compliance tool. One of the things I talk about with customers is you can actually have your pipelines to push out your stem cells. Just run the compliance scanner each time you're doing this. Now you have a report for every upgrade you have, so you can actually show your auditor, not only do we have new upgrades on a regular basis, but they have the standard configuration. Here's our report for every upgrade we've ever done. It's a great way of showing compliance automatically. You don't have to do anything for it. It just works.
Yep. The last line item, if you're not familiar with CF Butler, if you haven't used CF Butler, take a look at CF Butler, right? Chris did some great work with that. A couple of primary use cases. One is helping kind of clean up. It's a butler. It can help clean up your environment for unused SIs, unused apps, things like that. But we have a customer who's done some enhancements with Chris. This is one of the best ways I know of to get an inventory of the actual version of the build packs associated to the running apps on your platform today, right? So it's sort of, I mean, you can get that information in other ways. You can, and I've got some of those commands later in the deck, but CF Butler makes it really easy to grab an inventory of your currently running applications and the build pack versions and the other things that go with them. And you can save those snapshots off, or you can use them as part of your compliance thing. So CF Butler can be a big help in the compliance side. Secure storage.
So I do want to have a caveat here. In PCI, this is talking about storage of cardholder data. So we focus on this answer here around the idea that you're running a compliant environment inside the Pivotal platform. So this isn't, there are a lot of encryption that's dealt with inside the platform, but we really tried to focus on the idea of where would you use the product to actually do encryption of an application usage of compliant data. Yep. And that's kind of where we focus here on CredHub. Folks might be using CredHub as a key or a mechanism to actually work with the encryption. So we actually approach this idea of, if you're using CredHub to encrypt and store various parts within your application, how can you audit CredHub to show that your passwords and the various parts that you are using within CredHub are encrypted? Mm-hmm. So we approach it from that point of view. It doesn't mean that there's not a bigger scope we can look at. Again, this could be a week-long conversation.
We tried not to keep you here for a whole week. We didn't have enough whiskey for that.
So
so this is how you would audit the storage side, right? Primarily what we're saying is review the IaaS encryption mechanism, right? Whatever platform you're using, there are ways to encrypt that storage, right? So you should be auditing and reviewing that, looking at the key management, looking at the scripts that create it. We gave you here some information on if you're using CredHub to store secrets that access cardholder data or for other things that matter. We gave you some pointers here. And how can I actually prove to the auditor that the data in the CredHub database is encrypted, right? Because sometimes you'll have an auditor that says, well, show me, right? And so we've given you some stuff here going on, commands and some methods that you actually get in the environment, get onto the director, get into MySQL or Postgres, and you can actually select some data from the database and show, look, here you go, it's encrypted. And it's not base 64 encrypted, right? Where's my Kubernetes friends? Yeah, Kubernetes secrets are base 64. Yay, let's go. Secure transmission.
So, anyone here been using Pivotal for a long, long time?
Yeah. Aside from Sean.
So TLS is a very important thing. Even though PCI does not require you to encrypt within your internal network, it's a recommend. So I also recommend it if you're going to run an application, you want to make sure you have the container security enabled. So you're actually doing all the way down to the container, not just TLS, but MTLS. Steve and I have a lot of conversations every day about what does zero trust really mean. I came from an infrastructure side, so I always start with the ASGs. And let's define the networking side. And then Steve
I start with identity. What does zero trust mean? It's all about identity. Yeah, David and I are fun at the parties.
Yeah, we're available. Yeah.
The thing to point out here, though, is David mentioned, while PCI DSS specifically says you have to encrypt cardholder data transmitted over public networks, right? That's the actual requirement. Most security programs today in any company, they want sensitive data encrypted end-to-end on or whatever network you're on, right? Whether it's internal or external. So this conversation about TLS, like this is becoming just a default expectation. Like all traffic down to the app has got to be encrypted with TLS, hopefully mutually authenticated TLS, right? So that's the thing, which is, hey, what we have.
Yeah. The nice thing is, for those who are Windows users, you have options now.
Yeah, TLS to the app is in beta as of now in PAS Windows. So go forth and conquer.
So again, even though the platform itself is all internal, hopefully you're not running it publicly available on public IP addresses. You still want to have as much encryption as possible. There's been a lot of work over time to actually make sure the actual platform itself has encryption. And just about every component within the platform has TLS. Many of them have MTLS, which is great to actually see that happening internally. So again, if we have more time when we get on site, we actually walk you through how to actually validate and show those sort of things. But at a high level, here's some options that are available. Again, this can be audited in the manifest. You can be audited directly through Ops.
We didn't think manifest screenshots were nearly as great as UI screenshots.
So, again, you want to make sure you have the proper configurations. You want to make sure you have the proper ciphers. The default ciphers that we have may not be right for you. You want to make sure whatever organization you're part of, whatever the approved ciphers you need to have for your environment, make sure they're configured and set.
That top one, like, is anybody in this room still being told they have to support TLS 1.0 for their end customers? That's a real thing. I've talked to banks, for example, who say they have customers who are still on Windows, 8 or whatever needs TLS 1.0. Anybody in here in that camp? Okay, so unless you have a definitive defined business requirement that's been validated, TLS 1.2 is the only option you should pick here, right? You should never pick any TLS option lower than 1.2 unless you've got a validated business need for it, right? We put it here. We still have a few customers out there who do require this for their end users, but this is one of those you shoot yourself in the foot if you do it kinds of things, right?
And I will add, if you are PCI, it doesn't matter, these financial institutions, I can't understand why you would, some grandmother somewhere must have hundreds of millions of dollars, so
they do
to force that, but PCI requires 1.2. Yeah. So if you want to support that one customer that's worth billions of dollars and you want to support them, go buy them a new computer. Because honestly, if you have a compensating control for one item in PCI, as a former auditor, I want you to know, if you have a compensating control, it means you're not compliant.
I'm going to my bank and saying I want a new computer now. Nice. Yeah, so this is just some additional configuration options to make sure that mutual TLS is turned on between the Go router and the apps.
It's a great feature. I mean, there's a lot of things we can talk about this, and it gets really interesting when we talk about how do you audit a certificate that actually rotates.
Right.
So
yeah, on this one, and then this one, we did want to say yes. We thought all the way down to jumping on the VM, doing a TCP dump on the traffic, and then demonstrating that it's encrypted. So hey, here's some of that, right? Which again, this is just a taste of.
It is a requirement when you go through your audit. The auditor is going to say, okay, now validate and show me. I need to have you demonstrate that I can observe that traffic is encrypted. Right. So you're going to have to be able to show this. Sometimes they'll look at it and they'll just actually capture it at the internet side because it really is on public networks. So they might get it from the firewall or the load balancer or whatever's on the outside. But if you need to get it from the application, now this is, I want to just add to this. If you just do the TCP dump, you're going to get a lot of traffic. You're going to want to make sure that you actually can capture what the proper IP address or ports are. You want to make sure you actually gain the right traffic. Otherwise, you might get some unencrypted traffic and your auditors can go, wait a second, it's unencrypted. Then you have to go spend the time showing them that traffic wasn't from that application.
Yep. On to antivirus. Man, we are cooking.
Who loves antivirus?
Yeah, come on, AV all the way.
I'm just kidding. So there are solutions for both Windows and Linux platforms, so you can actually do antivirus. There's been an update recently where you can actually have proxy, where you can actually have centralized of all your definitions and all your VMs that are pointing to the proxy, so you don't have to have this wide open access and the configuration issues around that. So again, you can secure your boundary. You can have the one machine that needs to have it there. You can use schedule scans. It gets very interesting because there's a lot of customers who, have high usage workloads. So there are caveats to how you tune and run antivirus because it can have an impact on your environment. So PCI does require antivirus. I've seen different ways of approaching how you look at that. But Pivotal does have a solution for this.
Yeah, that was David's nod to me, in that we could have a debate for hours on the efficacy of antivirus on well-managed servers. Yet, nonetheless, PCI does not give you a gap there, right? You need to have AV if you're doing PCI. I did put the name change in here, right? So we did change the name of this product in the most recent release. So it's now called Pivotal Antivirus, not the Clam AV add-on for PCF any longer.
So.
Yeah. A couple of key things to audit when you're looking at AV. First, of course, is making sure it's actually scheduled to run and not disabled. So I put a red box around that. Don't disable it.
You'd be surprised if people actually install the product and go, hey, it's installed, but it's disabled.
Yeah. You also have to, of course, make sure your definition files are updated. One of the best ways to demonstrate this is to actually get on the boxes and show, do an ls-l on the definition files themselves. And so that's kind of what we've got here. This actually executes a remote SSH command, and then it'll tell you. In this case, just looking at the log, the fresh clam log is the update log for clam AV. So this will just dump the last 20 lines in that log file for your auditor and let them see that it's there. And then this is syslog. Always
forward your syslog. So by default, there are parts within the platform that don't forward logs. So you want to make sure that you've gone through and done the configuration options, and you're forwarding them onto the right place, and you have visibility to what's happening in the system.
But if for whatever reason you've decided not to turn on syslog forwarding, we gave you some of the 3 log files that are important for this add-on here. R6. Boy, we could spend the rest of this time on R6. Secure development practices. So one caveat here, right? We're giving you the pivotal talk here, right? We have a whole, like AppSec, so the secure development practices part of this could be another day-long conversation, right? AppSec and pipelines and all of that, and all of the partner solutions in that space. We left it out. Not that we don't want to acknowledge it or talk about it or know about it. It's simply, look, we only had an hour to talk to you all, and we don't have time to talk about AppSec here. So in R6, there's a lot of AppSec stuff in here. We've left it out of this conversation because, it's not part of the platform. It's part of your larger ecosystem, but it definitely has to be part of your program. And we would love, again, we come out, talk to you. We can talk about the R6 stuff forever. We're going to talk about the platform implications of what Rule 6 means from a platform side. This is our favorite topic, right? My favorite topic.
We have a lot of favorites. I'll let you continue talking since it's your favorite topic.
Yes, repave is, I always tell, I have these conversations and we talk about a lot of stuff here, right? I say, if you leave this room and you don't do anything besides repave weekly, I've done my job, right? Yeah. Repaving and restaging, but repaving provides one of the best bang for the bucks of any platform, period, from a security perspective. Like, I'm the security guy in here, and I'm like, if I could get everyone to repave everything to a golden image once a week, like, we would have a significant security improvement, right? Like,
yeah. Even if there's not an upgrade,
it's huge.
If the idea, in fact, it's been actually publicly spoken about, like Wells Fargo.
Yeah.
They're working toward getting daily repaving. We're talking thousands of systems out there. If you don't have to wait for a quarterly upgrade or any of those things. The idea of repaving allows you to, it's possible, if you haven't disabled SSH, which is another thing we can get into another time, is why do you have SSH on a production environment? If you have 10,000 containers, what can you SSH into to solve a problem? It's not going to. Just turn it off. So if you are having an environment that you have, things happening in the environment, if anyone happens to log in and do manual configuration change, that's remember, we're talking about environments for people who might be new to the platform. They're used to running Unix servers, the left and right. A problem comes in, you shell in, you make a config change, you restart a service. That causes problems. It causes configuration drift. It causes you to have non-consistent environments. But if you have a defined configuration that's approved by your security team, and you are doing a repave every single day, remember that you will not have an outage. This is zero downtime, canary-based staging, testing of your environment. Just push it out every day. If you're doing that, then you have a great set of controls to show that the actual environment is matching your approved configuration. It has the latest of everything out there, and it's just really a good idea.
With repave comes restage. So I've been in a couple, actually one very large customer. They have 14, 15 foundations, something like that. They have a PCI DSS foundation, a bunch of others. And they have applications that are very stable in their environment that haven't changed in a couple of them, like in a couple of years. Like, they have applications that literally they haven't changed in a couple of years running on the Pivotal platform. Guess how old the build pack is that those applications are running with? A couple of years, because they haven't gone through a process of restaging apps. If you know enough about the Pivotal platform, if you just restart an app, what does it do? It grabs the latest image out of the blob store and reruns that image. It doesn't recreate it.
And
right?
same if you're just repaving.
Right.
Just repaving is not doing anything with the app. It's going to repave
right.
the server.
It does a restart. So
grab the latest blob and just push it out.
So you got to do restaging. So we tell folks, look, you should be repaving through automation at least weekly, right? Should be your target for repaving the environment through automation. You should be restaging at least monthly, right? Restaging can actually have more impacts because you can pick up the newer runtimes, which sometimes can have some application challenges to them.
Which also goes back to the idea. Remember, when you're repaving, the whole platform has canary testing, has all the tools to make sure the platform itself will work. If you need to work with your developers, to make sure the applications themselves are designed to have the canary test, to be designed for having the blue-green. You want to make sure that when you're doing this restaging the application, it's designed in an environment that it shouldn't cause an outage, or if it does, you catch it through a test and it doesn't cause a customer problem. Yep. So if you've got the tests in place, restaging should not be scary.
Yep. And so I put this in here. There's a lot of talk this week at this conference. A lot of Spinnaker conversations. Spinnaker is really great on the app side, on the CD side. This actually will play into your compliance story on the app side. As you start talking about continuous deployment, Spinnaker is actually going to be a great tool for you to actually capture the artifacts you need to prove what releases were consistently run through your different environments, what artifacts were in those releases, because part of Spinnaker is an inventory system, right? So Spinnaker has inventory, it has monitoring, and it has continuous delivery capabilities, which you don't see. Concourse has great CI capabilities, but it doesn't give you any inventory. It doesn't give you any state, things like that's what CD actually gives you. So you should be looking at CD on the application side from a compliance perspective. And as we've been talking about today, on the Pivotal side, there's a new restricted beta for the Pivotal Delivery Service or Continuous Delivery Service. I don't know how they named it, but basically Pivotal's commercial implementation of Spinnaker with support and our own optimized version of the product. So that's something folks should be looking at from a delivery side. So auditing the platform. And again, we're talking again about sort of this R6, right? How do you prove that you've kind of got this secure platform?
So the security page here, I want to point out, this is one of those forward-thinking things. There is actually work going on right now to make your visibility into our security program a little bit better. So there's some work right now going on to actually make the security page much more useful to be consumed by end users. Things like, we have the list of RSSs on there, on the RSS feed of all the CVEs. Well, how does that apply to the stem cells? Which version, which stem cell patches which thing? The conversation around all that is a common conversation we have. For right now, a lot of customers just basically set up an RSS monitor. They have their Concourse pipelines, basically looking for new versions and pulling them as they go. But there's a lot of work being done to make sure that this is a better consumable product to help support your questions that are coming from, what vulnerabilities affect me if I'm on this version. So if you run your CF Butler and you get your versions of your build packs, what does that affect me? How does it tie together? So that's...
Yeah, the key things in here are, of course, all of this should be done through automation, right? You should not be doing any of this manually if you can avoid it. And so you should be making sure your automation is producing the logs that you can show your auditor that you're doing these things. And we've got a couple of key ones called out here. That 30-day timeline on stem cells is pretty important, right? The PCI DSS guidance gives you different timelines for critical versus other patches. But to be frank, right, if it's automated, it doesn't matter to your pipeline if the stem cell fixes a critical bug or a medium-sized bug, right? Mm-hmm. It's just an update. And so if you go through that, can just show consistently that my stem cell will hit production every time through automation within 30 days of a release, your auditor is going to be really happy with that. If you don't show that, you're going to have to go through all the exceptions and show one by one how it hit the critical ones, and it's actually going to be a bigger headache.
Dig through your emails. Who does change management through emails?
Jira tickets.
Yeah, so that's a lot of fun. We do mention the compliance scanner again here, so it's a great tool, and it is still, there's still so much more we can do with this. It is really on the platform. It doesn't get into the build packs. There's a lot of thoughts that can go into this, so please, if there are things that we can do to help make that a better product and help you solve your compliance and auditing needs, let us know so we can actually get the conversations going together and make it a better tool for you.
So then you've got that piece, which I was talking about, audit the automation, right? Make sure the automation is doing its job. But the auditors are still going to take a snapshot, like when they're in conducting the audit, they're probably going to want to see a snapshot of the running system as it is at this moment when I'm doing my audit, and validate the versions. So we've given you some information here. Run the commands to look at the versions of the stem cells. Another thing for CF Butler, Chris is going to have to give me some ad money here for pushing this. But if you don't use CF Butler, right, there's some other, I gave you some other commands here. You have to identify which droplets the app is using, and then you've got to do a curl command to look inside those droplets to look at which version of the build packs you're using. Ultimately, that was the data you're after, is what version of the build pack are you after.
But again, don't do it manually. If you have some scripters on your team, if you have a SecOps, the idea is to automate and write scripts around this, make it easier to work with. So use the APIs as they are meant to be from applications that can actually be repeatable. So you don't have to, every single time you're running this, go find the command, right, copy and paste it, get the results, just automate it.
Running these compliant workloads in Kubernetes adds a little complexity to the audit, because we don't know what tool you're using for making sure the OS is configured properly, or how the containers are configured, or vulnerability scans, or configuration scripts. Like in the PaaS platform, we have control of all that, so we can kind of tell you how to audit it more closely. And PKS Kubernetes, we can't tell you how to audit it yet because we don't know what build tool you're using. We don't know what automation tool you're using. But the point of this is look, if you're doing Kubernetes, and I said this before, you have got to have a build service that is providing the guardrails around how those containers are configured. That build service has to produce some audit logs and some definitions that the auditors can review to understand that they are actually configured according to the CIS benchmark or the DISA-STIG or whatever you selected. So,
and this last one I'll point out is a conversation I have on a regular basis, because a lot of companies are just trying to figure out how do we build those build services. And, the actual cognitive build service is not to a point where a lot of companies can fully use it yet. Yep. So they're asking, okay, how do we scan these images? How do we actually make sure we're compliant? And again, this is one of those conversations, reach out to your account teams. We have some partners we've worked with. The scanning side, if you are using PKS, you have Harbor, which has some scanning things built into it. But if you are not using Harbor, there are partners we work with, and we're happy to share those contacts with you as you need them.
Access control.
You like this one too.
I do like access control.
So who doesn't like using user IDs? You should not in any enterprise environment be using default built-in accounts. You should not be using, standalone. Your enterprise has domain controllers, other systems around there that are SAML compliant, tools that actually allow you to enterprise-wide control access to the platform. Use those and integrate those.
Yeah, you notice on this slide, I've highlighted SAML as the choice here. And the reason for that is because with SAML, you can enforce complex authentication rules like multi-factor authentication and other kinds of interesting things like time of day or device or other kind of fun authentication rules. And so SAML, because SAML goes to basically your provider to do the authentication, you have a lot more control over that. LDAP, right, is LDAP, and it's a rather simplistic protocol. You can't do a lot of complex authentication rules using LDAP. It's usually a 0 or 1, yes or no. That password is good. And so if you have to use LDAP, but ideally SAML would be your best choice.
So an interesting conversation around here also is how have you defined the groups and the roles between the systems? So Pivotal's been very, opinionated on what roles you need to have within the Pivotal platform. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. From the good point of view, from the auditor point of view, you don't have 4,000 possible configuration types you need to audit. It really is just here's the roles, and then how do you actually map those back to your business?
Mm-hmm. Yep, and so we'll talk about that, those pieces again in a minute. Of course, we've got to mention CredHub again, right? One of the key things is making sure, like we talked about manifests earlier, right, and showing manifests. Well, one of the things you might have to go through if you didn't have CredHub in the picture is a lot of secrets in those manifests. Actually, today most of the secret references in the manifests are CredHub references, right? Not all, I don't think they're 100% there, but many of those are in CredHub. Same for code, right? If you're using secrets in code, CredHub is a really good way to go with using that. But David was starting to talk about the user level RBAC here and how you've designed your orgs and spaces and your rules. This is an area where I've seen some customers actually not take the time and energy that they need to with their orgs and space design, and then with ASGs, right? Mm-hmm. So ASGs work at the space level. If you haven't followed that, so application security groups operate at the space level, right? So all of the apps within that space inherit those egress rules. And so when you do your org and space design, you have to actually do some mapping between what development teams are going to be developing the applications in here. You have to think about what egress rules those applications
are there,
would have. And then you have to think about like what brokers might I be using in this space, because brokers are also basically developer permission is scoped at the space level. What that means then is if you're a developer in space A, and you have a broker for, say, databases in space A, any developer can bind any app to any instance of any service in that space, right? So app A has a database and app B has a database. Nothing stops developer of app B from binding it to app A's database, right? So you can't have apps of different sensitivity levels within the same space. So you really should, as you think about orgs and spaces and roles and ASGs, really have this a documented, well thought out mapping about what apps go in what spaces and which ones can't go in the same spaces, and it's mostly around permissions.
And thinking of brokers, since we did mention CredHub has a broker service which you can use for applications. So keep in mind, if you're using CredHub as a service broker for your application for secrets, if you put multiple, again, it's like we just talked about the database, if you have multiple applications in the same space and you're trying to maintain secrets, there's nothing stopping a developer from taking app B to tie into your authentications. So you can have secret leakage and access secrets. So defining what's in these spaces, is really important, and you need to look at really, does it need to be there, or there's no penalty for you can have as many spaces as you need to have. We're not going to run out of spaces. So segment as best you can.
Well, it does. There is a little bit of penalty, right? So having hundreds of spaces, as you know, can actually create some toil, right? So there is some toil for a platform team if you have really, hundreds and hundreds of spaces that you have to manually manage if you haven't creted automation tools around it. So there is a balancing act.
They're all automated now. They don't have anything manual.
There's a balancing act in there, but you want to think it through. We've got some information here again on, reviewing the configuration tabs, doing some. I put some. Local user auditing commands here. So UAAC, that's the command line for UAA. If you need to audit some of the local users in there, this is how you'll do that.
And there will be local users. There's your local admin, the default users, but hopefully you're not going to have local administrators for your company with local users.
Well, it can't. So in OpsMan, you cannot have local users. They cannot authenticate.
Right.
Once you've enabled SAML or LDAP, you can no longer authenticate with those users in OpsMan. You can in AppsMan, apparently. The PAS tile also gave you some ways of auditing those users. That's another interesting thing. You've got to be careful with this, right? If when you connect PAS to your central identity system, which you're all going to do, right? LDAP or SAML, yeah. There's a mechanism to automatically create users based on group information in the PAS environment. There is no sync mechanism, however, right? So when you delete a user from your central identity system, that equivalent user account is not deleted from the PAS user database, and that can cause an audit problem, right? So your auditors might see these local users and say, why don't they match? So you do need a mechanism to regularly go through and remove these local users from the PAS environment, even though nobody can log in. So it's not really a security gap, because once you've removed their central identity, they can't log in. But having the identity here can actually cause questions for the auditors that you just don't want to have, right? So you want to kind of think about what the auditor is going to look at,
and they will,
and remove their opportunity to ask you a question, right?
Yeah, you want to have them focused on your compliance, and if they get caught up in the fact, oh, why does this user list not match this user list? You're distracting from the fact of what you're trying to get done,
right? And
now your nice little 6-week plan turns into an 8-week plan,
right?
And nobody wants that,
right? So with the PKS environment, I added a few extra things here. You have to do all of this stuff on OpsMan already, because PKS has an OpsMan installation as well. So you have to audit the OpsMan stuff as before, but then the PKS tile has its own UAA user database and its own set of users. So you have to audit those separate from the OpsMan ones, and you also have to look at the Kubernetes ones, right? So in PKS, you've got to audit the cluster roles and the role bindings and how those are connected back to groups. So hopefully in this case, you've tied them to groups and not users, right? When you bind your Kubernetes users, you're doing it at the group level. And so in that case, you don't run into that same sync problem on users, because now you're not creating individual users like you are in PAS. You're just connecting to the group, and so you don't have that problem.
And again, Kubernetes, we haven't talked too much about it, but the whole architecture question, how you design, how you actually tie together this picture of using Kubernetes, that's probably that's probably a
Yet
multi-day
another
conversation.
day. We could do a week-long session on this and probably still not have enough content.
So,
all right, David, one of David's favorite topics now.
So I do like the monitoring side better than the logging. Logging is something we have to deal with. There's a lot of logs that come out of platforms, a lot of logs. And for those who don't know it, there's actually a document out now that we can actually share that actually goes into correlations. So how do you actually know what is a login? What does CF push look like? What is actually the events around common practices within the platform? So if you have teams who are trying to do log monitoring and you're trying to figure out what does this look like, there's a lot of logs. What do I need to look at? Again, reach back out to your account teams. Reach out to us. We can help share the documentation. Right now it's on the Elk stack, but there is work being done to have Splunk tied into that. Mm-hmm. Interesting things with logging is you might have multiple teams that need the log data. So keep in mind that you're going to have your SOC department, you're going to have your operations teams, your apps teams, and the logs themselves can be defined through rules to actually map and filter based on what different teams need. Mm-hmm. So auditing the logs might be as simple as going to your Splunk server and getting some samples for your auditor, or you might have to actually go into the actual log. We've run to the end of our detailed stuff here.
This is where our details, we started to decide to drop some of the auditing details out because when we got to the R10, 11, and 12, we're like, we're going to run out of time.
Yeah, we had over 100 slides.
So auditing this will be, but one thing I always want to make sure of for folks is there are actually 3 places to configure log forwarding in a PaaS environment. And so make sure you've got them in all 3, right? Opsman has its own settings for log forwarding. PaaS tile has its settings. A PKS tile has its settings for log forwarding. And then you got to deal with your apps, right? Both in Kubernetes and in PaaS, you've got to make sure that the app level, you're getting that log forwarded over. And I always talk about, I can't go without talking about privileged users. You've got to have a tool to audit the activity of your privileged users.
And I do want to point out, it's very possible that because of the amount of logs that come out of the system, it's very possible someone in your SOC said, hey, can you go put a filter on these sort of things? So you will probably have to go down and actually look at the filters that are in place to make sure that there's not things that are excluded the auditor might want to have looked at. So you have to look at those as well. So security scanning and testing, as a former pen tester, is always a fun thing for me. I've done enough PCI pen tests for years that
David really loves, he really just wants to be a pen tester again.
I just like breaking things. I like understanding how things work.
He's also a hobby bricklayer, so hobbyist bricklayer.
Yeah, and once you need a fireplace built, I got one in my backyard. It took me 4 years to make it. We're getting there slowly. But on the scanning side, we do have tools and add-ons to the platforms that allow you to do the most common things in the platform. We have here, the antivirus, which we didn't change the name here.
I just said I didn't change the name here. Darn it.
File integrity monitoring. Actually, good news on this one is for those who have Windows workloads, there is a testing release of file integrity monitoring for your platform. So if you have a compliance need and you have Windows workloads and you need to have file integrity monitoring, let us know. There is a testing. It's not released, and I have no idea when the date will be released, but there are mechanisms now to support all of these workloads here that are useful. Now, IPsec, again, runs into problems in Windows, but if you're depending upon IPsec for your layer of control, you have a whole different scale of what needs to be done. PCI doesn't need IPsec, but these sort of tools are just the start of the sort of things you want to integrate. There's a lot of things that Pivotal, we're not we have a lot of security pieces, but we aren't a security company.
Although, once we joined VMware, us and Carbon Black, maybe we changed that a little bit.
So we want to point out this right here. We have a lot of partners, and this is an ever-growing list. Steve and I are very active with our security partners. We do webinars with them. We do joint understanding of what they do provide. We're trying to do this whole big picture of this one of those forward-thinking things. We're actually trying to go beyond the reference architectures and make a security reference architecture. So right now, what we're working on right now is tying together not just these, but all the up-and-coming vendors. Anyone here use Qualys? Anyone here fought Qualys before? I know. I've talked to a couple of you. Qualys actually has a tile coming. They're going to have their container scanning tool. It'll be out in Q4. And hopefully they'll have their vulnerability scanning tool coming out soon after that. So we'll see where that goes. But this is an ever-growing list. We want the best of breed. We want to make sure if there's someone on here that you don't use, if we're missing somebody, again, please reach out to our teams. We want to hear from you what tools you depend upon to run your environment. We want to make sure that the use and integration into the platform is the best experience it can be for you. It should not be difficult. You should not be doing manual intervention to make this all work. It really should be the easiest possible process for you. So since we did trim out a couple of things, we actually have time for questions.
Perfect. No, we timed this exactly as planned. We wanted to leave 10 minutes at the end for questions, and look at that, 10 minutes for questions. It doesn't get any better than that. All right, time for questions, comments, things we're missing.
You mentioned a lot of things that were in beta for Windows. Are C2C working now on Windows and
So careful with that. C2C does not do TLS on any platform today. If you're doing container networking, it is not TLS encrypted. It is unencrypted traffic. I don't think C2C is working on Windows. Oh, Jerome might know that. Does C2C work on Windows? Yeah. I think C2C works on Windows, but neither platform is C2C TLS encrypted.
But Windows does have TLS now.
Windows has TLS to the app in beta in 2.7.
Yes.
Yep, 2.7. So that's the latest one we just released, right? So 2.7 is what just came out. And so TLS to the app in Windows is in beta in that release. Yep. But C2C, you still, if you have to have TLS to but within the platform, you can't use C2C because it doesn't have TLS today. Other questions, things we're missing?
Yeah.
Early on, when you were asking about the dynamic egress policies,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
and just egress in general, you mentioned for like third-party traffic for third-party sites to use proxies. Are there any like recommendations?
So the question, if you couldn't hear the question was, hey, we were talking about egress traffic and using third-party like proxies for outbound traffic. He was asking if there's any that we've seen that particularly work well.
So it's a difficult question there because it's another service you have to manage and maintain. You want to have something out there. The best solutions I've seen in environments are really things that were already in existence before Pivotal showed up.
Yep.
Things that the teams are already used to managing. They have clusters. They have things that are defined in the environment. If you don't have anything, I mean, there's we can talk. I mean, there's a bunch of products that I most of them are open source based. There's Squid, which has some great tools. I've actually seen a Squid botch add-on, so you can actually push Squid out in the environment and have it tie into the proxy rules in the environment. It needs some tweaking. It was just a test that PA put together to actually show it could work.
Yeah,
but realistically, if you're going to use proxy, which I recommend proxies because they're a great control, but there are downsides to proxies. They slow things down. They are difficult to manage.
There's more toil.
Yeah, more toil, more pieces, more moving parts. But they are a great control because you can actually not just control the destination it's going to, but in many cases the full path of what you're allowing them to get to. So they're a great control for egress connections. Now it also assumes you're doing HTTP, which not all services are HTTP. Hopefully they are, but not all of them are. But I think Squid is one of the most robust on the market. If you're gonna have proxies, you might want to look at something based around that. But again, I don't know your enterprise. It really might depend upon what's acceptable for your business to run.
Yeah, that's not great for the great consultant answer. It depends. There's a question in the back here, ma'am. The email addresses, absolutely. I think I can do that. Hold on, let me escape here.
Just page back.
That's what I don't want to do that. I just want to.
So while we're getting that, is there, we'll go you back first.
So a while back, 3 R's was mentioned like a year or 2 ago.
Yeah.
Is credential rotation still a focus?
It is definitely a focus. There's been a so actually, sorry. The question is the 3 R's have been out for a while, and was wondering if the credential rotation is still a big focus. And yes, it is. There's actually been a lot of work in the last few months within the platform to do actually certificate rotation. So the platform is doing a lot of work internally to live up to that rotation of credential component. And honestly, as a security person, I would recommend that you have a mechanism for automating credential rotation and doing it as often as possible. One of the best ways attackers get to your environment is they get a credential, either through leaking or some, there's many ways of going about it, but you need to have a mechanism to make that credential, like the environment, as immutable as possible. And you want to make sure that credential is not something that's static and be tied to anything. So if you have a process, I recommend you rotate it as often as you possibly can.
You didn't see it here because, again, we had to cut so much stuff out. Everybody's heard most everybody's heard the 3 R's. And frankly, rotation of platform credentials really probably isn't going to come in the scope of a PCI audit.
No. It is a great thing to show an auditor, though, that the robustness.
So it's a great security thing, but not necessarily an audit compliance thing. So we said, okay, we'll talk about that some other time. Yeah. Question in the back here? You mean more roles? So the question was, are we expecting role-based access for ops manager? And I think what he really means is, are we expecting more roles
or better configuration,
or maybe configurable roles? We have roles. We have 2 for ops man, but there's only 2. Well, you shouldn't allow folks to use the shared credentials, right? So
Yeah.
the question was really a varied question, but I think it came down to the use of shared credentials within the platform and how maybe you can audit who does what.
And I will point out,
yeah.
PCI has a requirement you do not share
Yeah,
credentials.
so you should not allow use of any of those shared credential accounts. You should watch for them.
But if you
and
are
flag on it.
If you are going into the system and you log in Ops Man, you grab a password to do like a database or whatever it might be you want to do, it's something that you can actually go through the logs and see. Hopefully have a good jump box for the logging and monitoring.
That's where the jump box comes in. So when I talk about having privileged access management logging, your jump box should log those activities, and you should be able to tie back to the jump box who did what.
And hopefully you have something. I'm a big fan of full session capture. So if you're going to have an access mechanism to the environment, and if you want to talk about different ones out there, we can talk later. But you should capture the full session. That way, your administrators know they're being captured, so it prevents any sort of malicious activity. And I think we're about to run out of time here. So if you have questions, we'll be happy to meet afterwards and continue the question and answer. But I think we have like 30 seconds left here.
Yeah.
So
and if you want more detail on that question, but yeah.
Thank you.
Good. Thanks, everybody.